back and forth from GIS to PowerPoint. So how many of you know what GIS is, or have heard of it before? A little bit? All right. So just to kind of give you a brief idea. So GIS stands for Geographic Information System. And the whole idea is just a computer-based system including software, hardware, people, and geographic information that you're trying to represent. So a GIS basically is able to create, edit, query, analyze, and display map data or map information on a computer. And the whole basic premise is that you want to make sure that each piece of data has a specific location somewhere on the surface of the Earth. So it gives you the power to analyze it spatially rather than just, if you imagine an Excel file with a whole bunch of data points, you don't really have that same capacity. So visually it's a little more pleasing. So this is sort of your typical map layout. This is ArcMap. And if you kind of flip them on their side, you can imagine that you might want to add together hydrology, buildings, land cover, and a DEM, which is elevation, and kind of add that together and use that to analyze, let's say, where you wanted to build a park, or where you wanted to build a school, or where you wanted to develop some more houses, all sorts of interesting stuff. So why is it useful? So it allows you to collect and analyze large amounts of spatially encoded data. It allows you to record and monitor change in ecosystems or environmental parameters. Or I suppose from an engineering perspective, similar things. I'm an ecologist, so I'm biased. Almost every aspect of ecological research has some kind of spatial component. So I don't know if you can say this. I mean, engineering, I would say the same, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So you're always thinking about space and how things fit into a particular space or area. So this allows you to basically visualize that space and communicate that kind of data with the public very easily. And I think pretty important, how many of you are interested in going on to graduate school? A couple of you, maybe. Some of you are in grad school. All right, so you're obviously going to need to get familiar with writing grant proposals and manuscripts. And I would say like 9 times out of 10, most of these want some sort of map to say, this is the area that I'm working in, here are my specific study sites, et cetera, et cetera. So when I say GIS, I'm not actually just talking about ArcGIS. There are actually open source versions of GIS. There's GIS, GIS for you feeling sassy, QGIS. These are just a couple programs that they make available for free, and they're open source. And actually, does anybody use, I don't know if you guys use this, you guys use our software? No. So our software is sort of like using code to make statistical analysis rather than JMP or SAS or some other statistical program. But they've started recently incorporating map-making function. But as you can imagine if you had to code all of what we're going to do today, it's pretty labor-intensive. So we tend to use ArcGIS because it's pretty pricey, but we all actually get it for free from UCF, which is nice. It's more powerful in terms of analysis, and also I think a little bit more user-friendly than obviously just having a laundry list of code, although Matt will get into the code more later. There's those. So applications within GIS. So if you guys want to navigate to your all programs and just take a look at that one folder that says ArcGIS, and you'll see that you have a number of different applications within there. So the main one that we tend to use is ArcMap, is where you actually visualize it, and ArcCatalog is where you organize the information. So yeah, this is exactly what the slide is saying. ArcCatalog is where you have your organization of your files, and you can create new shape files. And ArcMap is what you saw before, where you're just displaying and editing and creating data. Yep, there it is. So this is what ArcCatalog will look like once you crack it open. In here you can create geodatabases, which we're not going to cover today, but geodatabases are essentially a way to make sure that your files remain, the data integrity is there and that the organization is there in your file. From here you can also create these shape files. You can also take those shape files and add new attribute fields to the attribute table, and you can just organize yourself from it. So this is a prettier one, obviously. This is ArcMap. We're going to be opening this up today and playing around with it. This is where you visualize your data, you can edit data, you can create new data, and finally you can create maps for publications. So let's get started. If you guys want to go back to that folder that you just navigated to and open up ArcMap. Not if you want to, you actually have to. Yeah, this is my one that I said. I'm not sure. I thought so. open it as everyone's opening. It might take a little while. All right, we'll wait. It's kind of slow. Or these computers are slow. It'll load up faster on your person.
Yeah, it was for
it should be in that file that we copied. So if you navigate to the one that you copied, IAHR.
Exactly. Well, the thing is, I saw it.
Yeah,
It was
so if you want to just navigate to that.
actual notebook. And I got the notebook and I was like,
I can do
it's
that.
a little smaller. Can I have that? And he's like,
You
sure.
want to shoot me on that?
Because it was like a wheel.
Alright, so it looks like everyone's got ArcMap fired up, and the first thing you're going to see is just a getting started screen that gives you the ability to use templates, but right now we're going to kind of, so you could save your map as a specific map document so you can load it back up later and have all the symbology and the imagery remain consistent, but for now we're just going to go with a blank map. So just select blank map, hit OK, and boom, you have it. So now we want to add some data. So right here, that little plus sign with the yellow background, that's how you add in existing shapefiles. I'm going to click that, and then navigate to that folder that I had you guys copy over that should have been IAHR workshop.
You want to talk about connecting to a folder real quick?
Yes. So if that wasn't there, or maybe it's not, there's a folder called folder connections. So let's say you don't have anything connected. So you want to go to this symbol that says connect folder with a little plus sign. And then once again, you just navigate to the folder you want to bring into ArcGIS so you can load files from it. So is everybody able to navigate to their IAHR folder and see these shapefiles pop up? So you just want to select all of these except for the text file. We're going to use that later. And just hit add. See if that works for everybody. Did you find it? Were you able to connect your folder? No, just my dot. Or wherever you save that IAHR folder. It doesn't look like that's where you save it. What? Oh, on the desktop. Then you need to connect to desktop. Yeah. So go back. Go back to folder connect. And then connect directly to the desktop. Yeah. So now whatever. So you want to just select all of it? Yeah, select.
Got it.
Alright. Right here.
Probably.
Yeah. Alright, so now you have. Alright.
Order
So
maps.
now what you should have is a point shape file of all the colleges in Orange County, all the roads in Orange County, the land use cover, which is all actually colored the same, but we're going to change that. And then underneath it all, you have just a boundary of Orange County. So this is how you turn these layers on and off. All you got to do is simply click those boxes. Maybe give that a whirl. Get back to where I was. So just to give you an idea of what you're looking at, all of those are something called vector data. Vector data is basically looking at everything in sort of a discrete way, and Matt's going to get into later raster data, which is more continuous. So this is basically every object in a layer lake. Imagine you have the outline of a city or the outline of a river or lake. So these objects all have discrete boundaries in space. So essentially vector data can also be defined as just a group of points, a group of lines, or a group of polygons that are all referred to as a feature class in GIS. And collectively those are just vector data, so it's kind of interchangeable. So this gives you, this is just another example. These are just roads, and those are just points along the road. Those are all vector data. This is really important. So when you guys downloaded that folder, you probably noticed that if you actually open it up on your computer, there's a whole bunch of files. But then when you open it up in GIS, there's only the 4 shape files and the 1 text file. That's because every shape file is actually comprised of at least 5 or 6, depending on the format, other files. So that's really important to keep track of, because if you move one file over to another folder, but you don't move, let's say, the projection file, now you have the points, but they don't have a space, they don't have that geographic component anymore. So just be aware of when you're just try to stay organized and try to be mindful of the fact that every shape file is going to have At least those top 3, and most likely additional, depending on the format of that shapefile.
That's why ArcCatalog is useful.
Yeah.
Because you can copy and move files from ArcCatalog. You'll just see like the main name. So if you have like roads, you'll have a roads.shp, roads.shnx. It'll move all those for you.
Yeah.
Just moving one file.
Basically, everything you just brought into here is from our catalog? Or
Yeah, well, you guys open it up from the folder, but
Right.
he's saying if you open up ArcCatalog and navigate it to that folder, it's going to symbolize it the same way it symbolizes it in ArcMap, which just makes it a little more simple. Like you said, you can just grab roads, drag it over to another folder. But if you open it up from your computer, essentially, you have to just be mindful of what actually makes that file. There's actually multiple files going to any given shapefile. This is what it would look like if you opened up just, looking at, going through my documents and go to IAHR and open up roads. You'd see a breakdown of, okay, it's got a projection file, it's got a shape file, it's got a GHB that has all that kind of attribute data, a variety of other things. So raster data is a little different. So raster data, you want to think about things like elevation, slope, and rainfall. They don't have distinct boundaries per se. They're actually continuous across the landscape. So this is very different from that discrete data that we're dealing with in vector data. So rasters are usually comprised of, just think of a grid, and each grid has a specific size, and you control what size that is if you're creating this data. But then each cell within that grid has associated value. So if this is a DEM, or representing elevation, if you zoomed in, there's just each of these has a cell, and each of those colors represents a different elevation within that raster. It's also important to note that pictures are essentially rasters as well. So if you brought in a picture of your dog and you zoomed into it, those pixels are essentially the cells I was talking about, and it's going to assign them different colors out, basically. All right, so let's go back to ArcMap and have fun with some of these tools. You guys see when these boxes pop up pretty well? Readable? Okay. So this toolbar right here, you can actually move all these around. It's kind of neat. So if I wanted to pull this out here, this is your standard toolbar. These are probably the most common tools that you'll be using. So pretty simple, every time you hover your mouse above them, it gives you a definition, which is pretty nice in case you forget. But just to go over it, so this plus sign is zoom in. So if you want to, grab that guy and try to just zoom in wherever you want, zoom in really closely to this road. The negative is the opposite, you're zooming out. This hand is really useful. This is what I probably use most of the time. This is just allowing you to pan along the map. So if I had more, if I had the entire state of Florida, I could just kind of scoot myself along that map. And then if I lost myself, I could actually just hit the full extent button. And what that's going to do is zoom to the exact extent of the largest shapefile that you have currently in your map. And then these guys are kind of similar. It's just a fixed amount of zooming in, and a fixed amount of zooming out, in case you don't like getting all freehand with it. This guy's also useful, so it's kind of the same concept applies. Let's take our little hand and get lost over here in space. So what this is going to do is actually go through each of those previous extents. So you can kind of backtrack until you find yourself back where you were. I know it sounds weird, but you can get kind of lost in the ocean somewhere, so these are kind of handy. And this is obviously the opposite of that. So if I wanted to go back to where I was, I could just kind of click through that. That kind of makes sense, hopefully. So, go back to tool set. This next tool is actually also pretty handy. It's called the Select Features tool. And there's actually several options it's given. If you click just on it, it's just a cursor select. So, I've just selected everything basically. But if you use that drop-down menu to the right, you actually have the ability to select by rectangle, polygon, lasso, circle, or line, which in a variety of. So let's try to zoom in to some of these tools. And let's hit. This is the clear. So you want to, if I already selected something, you want to make sure you clear it out later for analysis purposes. So let's click on this guy and try to select one of these tools. Oh, that didn't work. I might not actually be able to just click the tool.
You can,
But you
right,
get,
on the layers, if you right click,
yeah, I mean I could turn them off.
no, if you right click colleges,
Yeah.
you can say
Oh
selection.
yeah. Yeah, that's the fun thing about this. There's always more than one way about it if you wanted to right-click and just select within that layer. But I'm just kind of accustomed to, I guess my data is sparse enough that that usually is not an issue. Either way, this is kind of useful, so let's try that out. Now let's try to take this picture. There we go. So now, you have, in teal just means that it's kind of highlighted, so it doesn't look too significant, but if you right-click on colleges, you go down to Open Attribute Table, you'll notice that that's highlighted. So if I wanted to maybe just extract that point, now I can export that data, and I'm only exporting what I have selected. And so the rest of these are pretty simple. This is sort of just the same thing. Like if I was making a map, usually just use that really plain cursor to like move around to north arrow, move around to scale bar, that kind of stuff. This guy, the identity button, this is actually really pretty interesting. So let's click on this guy and do the same trick. Try to click that same tool. So rather than just highlighting it like you did before, it actually is going to bring up its entry in that attribute table. So now we know that we're looking at the University of Phoenix, and we have its area and its address and all this fun stuff that we can kind of scroll through. I don't think the rest of these are super useful. Well, these are useful. So this one with the ruler is a measuring tool. It's sort of probably not terribly exact though. So let's try to measure a distance between these 2 points, or whatever 2 points are on your map. So we want to drop down and look at all the distance options we have, and I'm going to go with kilometers. So all you need to do now is draw from this point to this point, and it gives you 0.72 approximately kilometers between those two colleges. It also gives you a variety of other things you could do. Like I said, it gives you all these different units, and then you could also kind of draw like a semi-polygon and get an area calculation. But like I said, these aren't super exact, so it depends on why you want to know the information. But for now, we're going to ignore the rest of it. Let's try this guy back up. So now, we're going to look at that text file that you had, and we're going to actually bring in XY data. Because right now, those points, those colleges, they just kind of already exist as GIS data. But what if you yourself had gone out into the field and collected a series of GPS points and you wanted to bring it into GIS? It's a little bit different. So first thing is, GIS is really picky when it comes to format. It sounds really odd, but something as simple as having spaces and a name will freak it out, and there'll just be sort of this really ambiguous error that happens that'll frustrate you for days. So you cannot use, so at minimum you have to have 3 things of data. You have an identifier column, an X coordinate, and a Y coordinate at the least, at the very minimum. And also within that, those column headers need to be less than 7 characters, containing no spaces and no special characters. So a lot of times you'll see, like this one right here, just uses underscores instead of spaces, but you can't have too many characters, so that would also kind of get moved down. And also, what I end up using the most is just decimal degree format. I mean, there are ways to import everything else, but I think this is a pretty standard way of bringing in latitudes and longitudes. So unfortunately, y'all's computers do not have a needed data connectivity driver. So we are not actually going to be able to import from Excel. So what I did was just save it as a text file. So if you save it as text tab delimited, it kind of works the same way. But for future use, it's pretty easy also to import from Excel. Let's go back to our map. What we want to do is click on File and then Add Data. And then within that, it gives you a bunch of options. We want to go down to Add XY Data. Because if you try to load it like we loaded the shape files, it's not going to recognize it, right? Because it's already not in the right format. So, with this drop-down menu, we want to actually hit the Browse button and navigate to wherever you saved that XY text data. It's named week 2. Kind of ignore that, but so find that guy, pull it in. It should automatically populate these drop-down menus because I named it X and Y. If it didn't, though, you have the capacity to drop down this menu and select if it, for some reason, didn't correctly identify your coordinates, but it did. And so we also want to make sure that we have the right coordinate system representing the points. So we want to go to Geographic Coordinate Systems, North America, and go to NAD 1983. shapefile yet. It's just bringing in the XY data. But we're going to have to export it as a shapefile if we wanted to turn that into a permanent shapefile. But what you should see is if you turn off colleges, hopefully if you did this right, you have a second set. They're the exact same point. So you can kind of alternate and see that they were projected correctly, which is nice. Doesn't always happen. Sometimes they get projected off in Africa and then you've got other problems. Alright, so everyone should have a map that looks at some point kind of like this, these 5 objects in the table of contents. We're all still on the same page?
No, almost.
You might have done that thing where you...
Was it 983?
Yeah.
Geographic.
Very good. I hope.
Okay.
Yep.
Good? Must be good.
This one.
Alright, so there's just some common terms to describe some of these things that you're looking at. First one is table of contents. So that pane that I was just pointing out, all the way to the left, that's just your table of contents. It's actually possible to turn that off, so just for funsies. Everyone just hit X. This happens at one point or another in your life. And then you're like, well, wait, how do I get back to my layers? How do I get my shapefile? It's actually pretty simple. This will help you eventually. You go up here and go next to the scale bar in this editor tool. There should be something that says table of contents. Boom. I know that sounds silly, but I can't tell you how many people lost their table of contents and had no idea how to get it back.
And they're stuck in the middle of the ocean.
Yeah, and they're stuck in the middle of the ocean, so they're about to drown. So also it's important to note the drawing order. So basically the way this is going to draw is from basically the bottom is the bottommost layer and the top is the topmost layer. So this is another thing that's a really common mistake. Let's say we go to our table of contents, turn everything back on, and then for some reason I loaded Orange County Blast. A lot of people look at this and they're like, well, wait a minute, I have these points and roads, where are they? They're actually just being drawn on top of by Orange County. So you want to just kind of be mindful of what gets drawn where and what order you have your shapefiles in. Kind of almost like a smallest to largest perspective. Or most. So I think I already mentioned the attribute table, but this is really useful. Obviously, you get a large data set. You're going to want to check out what data is being represented there. And so for things like labeling, try labeling, what you want to do is open that attribute table and ask yourself, which one of these columns would I like to label by? Probably name, right? So you can actually get out of that, right-click again, go to Properties, and this gives you the ability to do a lot of different things within that specific shapefile. But we want to go to the tab labeled Label. Click this box right here. And we already guessed that we wanted it to be listed by name, so that's kind of cool. But this would be the drop-down menu to change that. And then you have the ability to make that text larger, make it bold, get a different color if you want. Pick a fun color. Ugh, that's ugly, huh? But that gives you the idea. So if you wanted to turn that off, there's two ways to label, just like there are 2 ways to select, right? So you can either right-click and you see that the label feature is checked on, just turn that guy off. Or you can go back to the property, go back to the label tab, and unclick this box. And that's how we turn those labels back on. I think I already mentioned this, but just to reiterate, that I symbol is the identity symbol, so this is going to allow you to pull out specific points or specific polygons and pull up the attribute table that is associated with that specific point. And last but not least is the Symbology tab. So we're going to play around with that for a minute here. Go back to ArcMap, and let's re-symbolize the colleges. So we're going to right-click on that layer, going to go to Properties, and then click on the Symbology tab. And there's actually a variety of options here, but given that this is point data, we're actually just going to stick with a single symbol for now. But what you're able to do is just pick from a variety of fun symbols. So pick something fun. Pick this airport. And once again, you have the ability to change the color, that's a little more complicated. So right now, this is how it pulls it in, but these are actually several different types of land use altogether, obviously. So it doesn't help us to look at that all in the color blue, right? That doesn't really tell you what polygon represents what land type. So, if you want to, once again, right-click on that layer, and we want to go to categories, because we actually want to represent each of the different categories with a different color. So this drop-down menu, you've got two options. ID, not useful. Grid code actually represents a code that we've assigned to each land use type. And once you select that, you want to hit Add All Values. So what you're going to see is it gives you different color for 1,000. I believe 1,000 is like urban, and 2,000 is agricultural, so on and so forth. And the color ramp gives you the ability to kind of just display these in different ways. You know, if this was from sort of a good to bad scale, you might have that green to red. If it was sort of a density thing, you might just have a gradient of color. But that's not what this actually represents. These are just discrete categories. So we're just going to stick with it. So that re-symbolizes that layer as what it actually means. So we know now that these little ugly mustard colored blobs are representing 5,000, which is open water. If we didn't know that, let's just use this identity button. Click on one of them. Yeah, so that's just to back it up is 5,000. Does that make sense to everyone? Does anyone have any questions about symbology? So, down at the bottom left-hand corner, there's tiny little symbols right here. One of them looks like a tiny little map, and the other one looks like a tiny little paper map, essentially. But one is representing the data view, which we're in right now, and the other is representing the layout view. The layout view is something you would use when you actually want to arrange the data to export as a JPEG map or however you want to export it. So let's click on that guy, and then you'll notice it kind of rearranges everything. This is like just a sample of what, if you printed this right now, what it would end up looking like. And it's important to note that once you go to the layout view, you actually have a different set of tools now. You actually have specific layout tools. So if you were to go back to the old standard tools, this is another weird point of confusion. And you start zooming in, it actually alters what you had a picture of, which you might not want. This actually alters what you're looking at within the map preview. Does that make sense? So it's kind of, once again, just keep yourself straight on what buttons do what. So, now that we have all this pretty data, go ahead and make a map. So most of the elements that you normally see in a map are all contained in the Insert drop-down menu. So let's insert some kind of title. Give it whatever title you want. And that's going to pop up as sort of just a floating text box. You have the ability to kind of move that around. You also have the ability to change the properties of that text box. But we'll just keep it there for now. Let's also insert a legend. So right now it's already auto-populating it based on what I'm actually displaying, but those arrows going to either direction give you the ability to add or remove different things from your legend. But for now, let's just stick with land use. So there's a bunch of different options. You know, there's obviously the symbology for a legend, and then this is kind of important, the legend frame. So a lot of times the default is a clear background, but if you had imagery in the background, you wouldn't really be able to read your legend. So it's kind of important to think about, all right, I'm going to make my background white rather than clear. So just click next on all of these guys and hit finish. What you should end up with, this guy here, once again, if you click on him with this arrow, you have the ability to move him around and resize him if you wanted it to be bigger or smaller. Also, you have the ability to, if you didn't, obviously this isn't very professional to have, like if I was making a publication, I would name that something to look pretty. It wouldn't be, you know, uncapitalized OC underscore. So